What happens when the most powerful female billionaire in the country is framed, stripped of her empire, and abandoned by her top-tier legal team in the middle of a high-stakes arbitration? She is left completely alone, waiting for the gavel to strike and destroy her life, until a man in a stained blue uniform steps past the velvet ropes. He isn't a hotshot attorney. He's the man who cleans her floors, a single father who looked the hostile boardroom in the eye and roared, "I will defend her." The marble floors of the Aegis Therapeutics skyscraper gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of midnight. To the executives who occupied the 52nd floor, the polished stone was a reflection of their own power and wealth. To Thomas Dempsey, it was just another 3,000 square feet of back-breaking labor. Thomas pushed his heavy yellow mop bucket down the silent corridor, the squeak of his rubber-soled shoes echoing in the emptiness. He was 32 years old, though the deep lines around his eyes made him look 10 years older. Beneath his faded blue janitorial uniform was a man who had once been destined for greatness. 5 years ago, Thomas had been at the top of his class at Columbia Law School, a brilliant mind with a lucrative corporate career waiting for him. Then, his wife Sarah was diagnosed with an aggressive glioblastoma. The medical bills piled up, drowning them in crushing debt. Thomas dropped out of law school to care for her full-time. When Sarah passed away, she left Thomas with a shattered heart, a mountain of financial liabilities, and their beautiful daughter, Lily. Now, Lily was 7 years old, battling severe asthma that required expensive medications and frequent doctor visits to survive and provide for his little girl. Thomas took whatever work he could find that allowed him to be at her bedside during the day. He traded legal briefs for bleach and courtroom debates for the quiet solitude of the night shift. He was the invisible man of Aegis Therapeutics, a ghost who emptied trash cans and scrubbed toilets for the billionaires who didn't even know his name. One of those billionaires was Madeleine Whitmore. At 34, Madeleine was the self-made CEO and founder of Aegis Therapeutics, a pioneer in autoimmune disease research. She was fiercely intelligent, famously uncompromising, and currently the target of a massive corporate assassination. For the past 3 months, Madeleine had been under siege. A rival pharmaceutical titan, Gideon Holt, CEO of Omnicorp, had engineered a flawless, devastating smear campaign. Documents had been forged, offshore bank accounts had been created in her name, and a whistleblower had been paid to claim Madeleine was embezzling $80 million from her own company's research and development fund. The trap was closing. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, an emergency arbitration hearing was scheduled in the executive boardroom. If the independent arbitrator ruled against her, the hostile board of directors, who had been secretly bought off by Gideon Holt, would immediately vote to strip Madeleine of her CEO title, freeze her assets, and hand the company over to Omnicorp in a hostile takeover. Madeleine's only hope was her lead counsel, the high-profile and ferociously expensive corporate attorney, Preston Corwin. It was 11:45 p.m. Thomas was quietly fixing a leaking pipe inside the handicap stall of the executive men's washroom. The heavy oak door swung open, and footsteps clicked sharply against the tile. Thomas remained quiet, not wanting to disturb an executive working late. "I don't care what time it is, Holt. I said it's done." A hushed, sharp voice echoed through the restroom. Thomas froze. He recognized the voice. It was Preston Corwin. "Yes, Gideon," Corwin continued, pacing in front of the sinks. "I have the finalized injunction documents. Madeleine has no idea. She still thinks I'm preparing a defense for the arbitration tomorrow. But when Judge Leonard Harrelson bangs the gavel at 10, I'm going to stand up and recuse myself. I'll cite a sudden, irreconcilable ethical conflict. I will tell the arbitrator I cannot in good conscience defend her, because I've discovered evidence of her guilt. Thomas barely breathed. He pressed his ear against the cold metal of the stall door. Without legal representation, she won't be able to file an emergency stay. Corwin laughed softly. A cold, venomous sound. The board will vote her out in 60 seconds. By noon. Aegis Therapeutics will belong to you, and she'll be facing federal indictment. Just make sure my partnership at your firm is in writing, and the $5 million wire hits my Cayman account by morning. There was a pause as Corwin listened to the voice on the other end. I'm tossing the burner phone right now. Relax. Gideon, tomorrow. Madeleine Whitmore loses everything. A loud clatter echoed as Corwin tossed something heavy into the stainless steel trash receptacle near the door. The oak door swung shut, and the restroom fell deathly silent again. Thomas waited 2 full minutes before unlocking the stall door. He stepped out, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked over to the trash can and peered inside. Lying on top of a pile of discarded paper towels was a black, prepaid burner phone. Thomas reached in and pulled it out. The screen was locked, but the implications were crystal clear. The most powerful woman in the building, a woman whose company manufactured the very asthma medication that kept his daughter Lily breathing, was being led straight to the slaughter by the man paid to protect her. Thomas stared at his calloused hands. If he got involved, he would be fired. He would lose the meager income keeping a roof over Lily's head. But as he looked down at the burner phone, the dormant fire of the law student he used to be flared back to life. He knew the law. He knew exactly what a premeditated withdrawal of counsel meant in a binding arbitration proceeding. It was a death sentence for Madeleine. He slipped the phone into the pocket of his uniform. He couldn't let an innocent woman be destroyed by corporate vultures. The invisible man was going to have to step into the light. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled executive boardroom was suffocatingly tense. The morning sun poured over the Manhattan skyline, illuminating the 52nd floor in a harsh, unforgiving glare. At the head of the massive mahogany table sat arbitrator Leonard Harrelson, a stern, retired federal judge known for his zero-tolerance policy toward corporate fraud. Flanking him were the 8 members of the Aegis Board of Directors, led by Chairman Richard Belmont, all of whom wore thinly veiled expressions of predatory anticipation. Sitting alone on the defensive side of the table was Madeleine Whitmore. She looked pale, having not slept in days, but her posture was impeccably straight. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Next to her sat Preston Corwin, looking perfectly composed, adjusting the cuffs of his $5,000 suit. "We are on the record," Arbitrator Harrelson announced, his voice booming through the chamber. "This is an emergency binding arbitration regarding the immediate removal and asset seizure of CEO Madeleine Whitmore, pending allegations of gross financial misconduct and embezzlement. Mr. Corwin, you have the floor to present the defense's preliminary objections." Madeleine leaned toward her lawyer, her voice a desperate whisper. "Preston, hit them with the forensic accounting report. Show them the offshore accounts were opened using forged signatures." Preston Corwin did not look at her. He stood up slowly, buttoning his jacket. He looked at the board members, exchanging a brief, knowing glance with Chairman Belmont, before turning to the arbitrator. "Your Honor," Corwin said, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room, "I do not have a preliminary objection to file." Madeleine's head snapped up. "Preston, what are you doing?" Corwin ignored her. "In fact, Your Honor, it is with deep regret that I must inform this tribunal that I am formally withdrawing as lead counsel for Madeleine Whitmore. Effective immediately. A shocked gasp rippled through the room, though the board members barely concealed their smirks. Madeleine felt the blood drain from her face. The room began to spin. "Mr. Corwin, this is highly irregular." Arbitrator Harrelson frowned, peering over his glasses. "You are abandoning your client at the 11th hour. On what grounds?" "On the grounds of ethical obligations under the Bar Association, Your Honor." Corwin lied smoothly, placing a hand on his chest. "Late last night, I came into possession of undeniable proof that my client has indeed committed the financial crimes she's accused of. I cannot, in good faith, represent a client who has continuously lied to me and attempted to use my firm to further a criminal enterprise." That is a lie!" Madeleine shouted, slamming her hands on the table and standing up. Panic clawed at her throat. "He's lying! This is a setup! Order! Ms. Whitmore!" Harrelson banged his gavel. "Mr. Corwin, your withdrawal is noted, Ms. Whitmore, as you currently have no legal representation to dispute the motion. I am left with no choice but to entertain the board's immediate vote for your removal and the freezing of your assets." "You can't do this! Give me time to find another attorney!" Madeleine pleaded, her voice trembling. The empire she had built with her bare hands was being stolen in broad daylight, and she was utterly powerless to stop it. The bylaws dictate that emergency injunctions cannot be delayed. Chairman Belmont sneered from across the table. "I call for a vote to remove Madeleine Whitmore." "Wait!" The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the boardroom burst open. Every head in the room snapped around. Standing in the doorway was Thomas Dempsey. He was still wearing his blue janitorial uniform, a faded name tag stitched over his chest. His hands were calloused, his boots were scuffed, but his eyes burned with an intense, unyielding fire. "Security!" Belmont roared, standing up in outrage. "Who let the cleaning staff in here? Remove this man at once!" Two large security guards stepped forward, reaching for Thomas's arms, but Thomas neatly sidestepped them, striding confidently down the center of the boardroom. Under Section 4, Article 12 of the Aegis Therapeutics Corporate Charter, any shareholder of this company possesses the right to appoint a proxy representative in the event of an unrepresented arbitration. Thomas's voice boomed with the trained resonance of a seasoned litigator. The sheer authority in his tone stopped the security guards in their tracks. Thomas pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and slammed it onto the table in front of the arbitrator. "At 8 a.m. this morning, I purchased exactly 1 share of Aegis Therapeutics stock on the open market. I am a shareholder, and I am officially offering my services as proxy counsel to Ms. Whitmore." Arbitrator Harrelson looked at the piece of paper, then up at Thomas, utterly bewildered. You are the janitor." "I am a shareholder," Thomas corrected coldly. He turned his gaze to Madeleine. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock, confusion, and a faint glimmer of desperate hope. She recognized him. He was the man who always smiled at her when she left the office at 2 a.m. "Ms. Whitmore," Thomas said softly, his voice dropping to a reassuring tone. "Do you accept me as your proxy representative?" Madeleine looked at the smirking face of Preston Corwin and the hostile glares of the board. She had nothing left to lose. "I do," she said firmly. "I accept." "This is a farce!" Corwin spat, his composed facade cracking. "Your Honor, you cannot allow a man who cleans toilets to argue corporate law. He has no legal standing." Thomas turned to Corwin. a deadly calm washing over him. "My standing is just fine, Mr. Corwin. Unlike your ethics." Thomas reached into the pocket of his uniform and pulled out the black burner phone, placing it deliberately on the mahogany table. Corwin's face instantly went ash white. "I will defend her," Thomas declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "And my first motion as proxy counsel is to introduce evidence of extreme attorney misconduct, bribery, and criminal conspiracy between Preston Corwin and Gideon Holt of Omnicorp Pharmaceuticals." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that precedes a devastating storm. Preston Corwin stared at the black plastic device on the mahogany table as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, sliding down his perfectly manicured face. The smug, predatory confidence he had exuded just moments ago evaporated, replaced by the stark terror of a man whose airtight conspiracy had just been blown wide open by the lowest-ranking employee in the building. "Whoa, what is the meaning of this?" Arbitrator Leonard Harrelson demanded, his voice dropping an octave as he leaned over the table. He looked from the burner phone to the man in the faded blue janitorial uniform. "Mr. Dempsey, you are making extraordinarily severe accusations against a senior partner of a major New York law firm. You had better be prepared to back them up with more than a piece of plastic." "I am entirely prepared, Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice level and devoid of intimidation. He stood with the perfect, relaxed posture of a seasoned trial lawyer, a stark contrast to his scuffed work boots and bleach-stained uniform. "Late last night, at exactly 11:45, I was performing maintenance in the executive washroom on this floor. Mr. Corwin entered, unaware of my presence in the closed stall. I personally overheard him conducting a conversation on that exact burner phone with Gideon Holt, the CEO of Omnicorp." This is hearsay. It is an absolute fabrication," Corwin shouted, his voice cracking slightly. He slammed a hand on the table, pointing an accusing finger at Thomas. "This man is a disgruntled floor sweeper looking for a payout. Your Honor, I demand he be removed and arrested for trespassing." "Sit down, Mr. Corwin, or I will have you removed," Harrelson barked, slamming his gavel. He turned his piercing gaze back to Thomas. "Continue, Mr. Dempsey." Madeleine Whitmore watched Thomas, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She was a billionaire who had faced down ruthless hedge fund managers and hostile foreign investors. But she had never seen anyone command a room quite like this. The man who emptied her wastebaskets was dismantling a corporate coup with surgical precision. "During this conversation," Thomas continued, addressing the arbitrator while keeping his eyes locked on Corwin, "Mr. Corwin explicitly detailed his premeditated plan to withdraw as Ms. Whitmore's counsel at the exact moment this hearing began. The goal was to leave her defenseless, so this board could execute an immediate, unchallenged vote for her removal. Furthermore, Mr. Corwin confirmed that he was doing this in exchange for a guaranteed partnership at Omnicorp's retained firm and a $5 million wire transfer to his offshore account at Cayman National Bank. Chairman Richard Belmont shot out of his chair, his face flushed with rage. "This is absurd. Are we really listening to the delusions of a janitor? Arbitrator Harrelson, this is a delay tactic. The board demands our right to vote on the CEO's removal under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the established precedents of the Delaware Court of Chancery." Thomas countered instantly, his voice echoing with authoritative thunder. "A board of directors cannot execute an emergency removal of a chief executive if there is credible, pending evidence of collusion and fiduciary breach among the board members themselves, and Mr. Belmont, since you just broke into a sweat the moment I mentioned Omnicorp, I highly suggest you sit down before I subpoena your personal bank records for the last 90 days. Belmont's jaw dropped. He looked at Corwin, then at the other board members, who suddenly looked terrified. He slowly sank back into his leather chair. As for the evidence, Your Honor, Thomas said calmly, reaching out and tapping the burner phone. It is a prepaid model, but it is currently pinging the local cell towers. A simple subpoena to the telecommunications provider will reveal the call logs. I am confident you will find a 12-minute conversation at 11:45 last night with a number registered to Gideon Holt's private residence. Furthermore, a forensic audit of Cayman National Bank will reveal a pending wire transfer directed to Mr. Corwin. Thomas placed both hands on the table, leaning in toward Harrelson. Your Honor, this is not a defense hearing. It is a crime scene. I am formally filing a motion for a 72-hour stay of all arbitration proceedings. I also request an immediate freeze on Mr. Corwin's assets, and I ask that you refer this matter to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York for investigation under the RICO Act. Corwin collapsed back into his chair, the remaining color draining from his face. He knew he was trapped. The burner phone could easily be traced, and the offshore wire transfer was real. His career was over, and federal prison was a very real possibility. Arbitrator Harrelson stared at Thomas for a long, heavy moment. He had presided over hundreds of high-stakes corporate disputes. But this was unprecedented. He looked at the trembling lawyer, the terrified board of directors, and finally at the stoic, brilliant man in the janitor's uniform. Mr. Dempsey, Harrelson said slowly, a faint glimmer of respect in his eyes. I don't know where you learned to litigate like that, but your motion is granted. All arbitration proceedings regarding the removal of Madeleine Whitmore are suspended for 72 hours. Furthermore, I am impounding this device and notifying federal authorities of suspected corporate espionage and extortion. Harrelson struck his gavel with a resounding crack. This hearing is adjourned. The boardroom erupted into chaos. The board members scrambled to pack their briefcases, whispering frantically to one another. Preston Corwin sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead as the reality of his ruin washed over him. Madeleine let out a breathless gasp, her hands shaking as the crushing weight of the last 3 months suddenly lifted. She had survived. Her company was still hers. She turned to look at Thomas, but the janitor was already walking toward the exit, slipping quietly away from the chaos he had just orchestrated. "Wait!" Madeleine called out, grabbing her briefcase and rushing after him. She caught up to him in the carpeted hallway just outside the boardroom. "Mr. Dempsey! Thomas! Wait!" Thomas stopped and turned, his expression unreadable. "You need to secure a real attorney. Ms. Whitmore, a federal one. You have 3 days to lock down the board and find the forged documents Holt planted." "I don't want another attorney," Madeleine said, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "I want you. Who are you? How do you know Delaware corporate law? How did you do that?" Before Thomas could answer, his cheap cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, and his stoic expression instantly shattered. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed in his eyes. "I have to go," Thomas said, his voice suddenly desperate. He turned and sprinted down the hallway, leaving the billionaire CEO standing alone in the corridor. Madeleine Whitmore did not become a billionaire by taking no for an answer, nor by letting mysteries walk away from her. The moment Thomas Dempsey sprinted into the elevator, she pulled out her phone and dialed her head of private security. Within 3 minutes, she was in the back of her armored, sleek black SUV, following the battered 10-year-old sedan Thomas drove as it sped erratically through the crowded streets of Manhattan. The chase ended 15 minutes later in front of the emergency room doors of Mount Sinai Hospital. Madeleine stepped out of her vehicle, her designer heels clicking against the pavement as she hurried through the sliding glass doors. The chaotic noise of the ER washed over her, crying children, shouting nurses, the steady beep of heart monitors. She scanned the crowded waiting area and finally spotted the bright yellow fabric of Thomas's work jacket, disappearing down a sterile white corridor toward the pediatric intensive care unit. Using her status as a major hospital donor, Madeleine bypassed the security desk and quietly followed him. She stopped just outside room 412, peering through the small glass window of the heavy wooden door. Inside, Thomas was on his knees beside a small hospital bed. Lying on the mattress was a fragile, pale little girl, no older than 7, with a tangle of dark curls spread across her pillow. An oxygen mask covered her small face, and her chest heaved with labored, wheezing breaths. Thomas was holding her tiny hand in both of his, tears streaming down his face, whispering frantic, soothing words that Madeleine couldn't hear. Dr. Reynolds, the head of pediatric pulmonology, stood on the other side of the bed, adjusting an IV drip. Madeleine cracked the door open just an inch, straining to listen. Her airways are severely inflamed. Thomas, Dr. Reynolds said softly, his tone laced with deep sympathy. This asthma attack was the worst one yet. The standard nebulizer treatments aren't keeping the inflammation down anymore. If we don't start her on the experimental biologic therapy by the end of the week, I'm afraid her lungs might sustain permanent damage. Thomas buried his face in the mattress, his broad shoulders shaking. I don't have the money, Doc. My insurance from the cleaning company won't cover experimental treatments. I've maxed out every credit card. Please. There has to be a generic option. Something. I'm sorry, Thomas. Dr. Reynolds sighed. The medication she needs is exclusively patented. It costs nearly $8,000 a dose. I'll try to get hospital administration to approve a charity grant, but it could take months. Madeleine felt a cold lump form in her throat. She stepped back from the door, leaning against the hospital wall as the realization hit her like a physical blow. She knew exactly what experimental biologic therapy Dr. Reynolds was talking about. It was called Respiro X. It was the flagship drug developed and patented by Aegis Therapeutics, her company. The man who had just risked his entire livelihood, his freedom, and his safety to save her empire, couldn't even afford the life-saving medication her company produced to save his own daughter. Madeleine pulled out her phone and immediately dialed her executive assistant. Get me the HR file on Thomas Dempsey, janitorial staff. I want everything: background, education, financial history. Send it to my secure tablet right now. 10 minutes later, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a cold cup of coffee, Madeleine read the file. The truth of Thomas Dempsey was more tragic than she could have ever imagined. Thomas hadn't just been a law student. 5 years ago, he was the editor-in-chief of the Columbia Law Review, graduating at the absolute top of his class. He had secured a guaranteed partnership track at one of the most prestigious corporate firms in the world. He was a prodigy. But then, his wife's terminal cancer diagnosis derailed everything. He had liquidated his savings, dropped out of the legal world, and taken on massive debt to pay for her care. When she died, he was left with nothing but crippling loans and a sick child. To maintain a flexible schedule for his daughter's constant hospital visits, he had hidden his brilliant mind behind a janitor's uniform, working the graveyard shift. Madeleine wiped a stray tear from her cheek. She stood up, her posture straightening, the fierce CEO returning to her eyes. She marched back down the corridor and pushed open the door to room 412. Thomas looked up, startled. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. Ms. Whitmore, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. Madeleine ignored him. She looked at Dr. Reynolds. Doctor, this child is to receive the full course of Respiro X therapy immediately. I don't care about the insurance. Bill the entire treatment plan directly to my personal accounts at Chase Manhattan. If the hospital administration gives you any trouble, tell them Madeleine Whitmore will pull her $10 million endowment wing by morning. Dr. Reynolds's eyes went wide. Yes, Ms. Whitmore. Right away. He quickly exited the room to process the orders. Thomas stood up, his face a mixture of shock, pride, and overwhelming relief. Ms. Whitmore, you didn't have to do that. I can't pay you back for that. You already paid me back. Thomas, Madeleine said softly, walking over to the bed and gently touching Lily's blanket. You saved my life's work today. You stepped into a room full of wolves and tore them apart. She turned to face him, her expression hardening with resolve. I read your file, Thomas. I know about Columbia. I know what you gave up. Thomas looked away, shame flashing in his eyes. That life is over. I'm just a guy with a mop now. Not anymore, Madeleine stated fiercely. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek silver business card, pressing it into his calloused hand. Preston Corwin is gone, and Gideon Holt is going to launch an all-out war against me to take my company before the 72-hour stay expires. I need a general. I need the smartest, most ruthless corporate mind in the city. Ms. Whitmore, I haven't practiced law in 5 years, Thomas protested. I don't care, she shot back. I am formally offering you the position of Chief General Counsel for Aegis Therapeutics. Your starting salary is $2 million a year, with full executive medical benefits for Lily. We have exactly 3 days to find the evidence Holt used to frame me, and we are going to burn Omnicorp to the ground. Will you help me? Before Thomas could answer, his phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't the hospital. He looked at the caller ID. It was an unknown number. He answered it on speakerphone. Hello, Mr. Dempsey. A chilling, gravelly voice echoed from the speaker. My name is Detective Sullivan. I work private security for a man named Gideon Holt. You made a very powerful enemy today. Janitor. I just wanted to let you know that if you ever step foot inside the Aegis building again, we won't be coming after you. We'll be visiting room 412 at Mount Sinai. The line went dead. The blood drained from Madeleine's face. She looked at Thomas, expecting him to finally break, to run away and protect his child. Instead, she saw something terrifying. The exhaustion in Thomas's eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, murderous fury. He looked at Madeleine, crushing the silver business card in his fist. I accept the job, Ms. Whitmore. Now, let's go destroy Gideon Holt. The threat against Lily's life did not paralyze Thomas Dempsey. It weaponized him. Within 45 minutes of the terrifying phone call from Gideon Holt's fixer, Madeleine Whitmore had mobilized her vast resources. She dispatched a team of 6 heavily armed private military contractors to Mount Sinai Hospital, under Dr. Reynolds's supervision. Lily was quietly transferred via private ambulance to a secure, subterranean VIP medical bunker located beneath Madeleine's own sprawling estate in the Hamptons. The bunker was equipped with state-of-the-art respiratory equipment and guarded around the clock. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas knew his daughter was truly, undeniably safe. With Lily secured, the war began. The library of Madeleine's estate was converted into a makeshift command center. The sprawling mahogany tables were covered in financial ledgers, corporate bylaws, and hundreds of pages of subpoenaed banking records that Madeleine's loyal administrative staff had managed to secure before the board could lock them out. Thomas stepped into the library. He had shed his faded blue janitorial uniform. Madeleine had ordered her personal tailor to outfit him, and he was now dressed in a razor-sharp, charcoal-gray bespoke suit. His jaw was cleanly shaven, his posture perfectly rigid. The exhausted my invisible floor sweeper was dead. In his place stood the brilliant, ruthless legal prodigy who had once commanded the Columbia Law Review. Madeleine looked up from a stack of bank statements, her breath catching slightly in her throat. The transformation was staggering. "You look like a completely different man," she murmured, stepping around the table. "I am the man you hired to tear Omnicorp apart," Thomas replied, his voice cold and analytical. He walked over to the sprawling whiteboards that covered the library walls. "Let's review the battlefield. Ms. Whitmore, we have 68 hours until arbitrator Harrelson lifts the stay. Gideon Holt's narrative is that you personally embezzled $80 million from the R&D fund and wired it to 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He produced documents with your signature to prove it, and he paid a whistleblower to testify. But I never signed those transfer orders," Madeleine insisted, her eyes flashing with frustration. "The signatures are perfect forgeries, and I still don't know who the whistleblower is. The board kept the identity sealed under a whistleblower protection motion. We don't need the board to unseal the identity," Thomas said, picking up a black dry erase marker. "Because I already know who it is, and I know who forged your signature." Madeleine stared at him in utter disbelief. "How could you possibly know that? My own private investigators haven't been able to figure it out in 3 months. Thomas turned to face her, a dark, knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Your private investigators look at digital footprints, Ms. Whitmore. They look at encrypted emails and offshore wire routing numbers. I look at the things people throw away. For 3 years, I was a ghost in the Aegis Therapeutics building. Executives don't notice the janitor. They leave their office doors open. They leave sensitive files on their desks while they go to the washroom. And most importantly, they throw their mistakes in the trash." He began writing rapidly on the whiteboard. "An $80 million wire transfer cannot be executed by the CEO alone. It requires dual authentication from the chief financial officer, William Hastings." "William?" Madeleine gasped, shaking her head. "No, William has been with me since the company was a startup. He's my most trusted friend. He's Lily's godfather, for heaven's sake. He wouldn't betray me." "Desperate men do terrible things," Thomas said softly, the marker squeaking against the board. 3 weeks ago, I was emptying the shredder bins on the executive floor. The machine in Mr. Hastings' office jammed. I had to pull the paper out manually. It was a notice of foreclosure on a massive property in Aspen, along with 3 demand letters from an illegal offshore sports book. Hastings is drowning in gambling debt. Ms. Whitmore, millions of dollars. Madeleine sank into a leather armchair, the betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. "But that's not the smoking gun," Thomas continued, his eyes narrowing. "Last Tuesday, I found a receipt for a high-grade synthetic polymer stamp in Hastings' personal wastebasket. It was purchased from a specialty forgery shop in Geneva. Hastings didn't just authorize the transfers, Ms. Whitmore. He bought a micro-stamper to perfectly replicate your signature on the hard copies. Gideon Holt paid off his gambling debts, and in exchange, Hastings became the whistleblower and forged the documents." "We have to take this to arbitrator Harrelson immediately," Madeleine said, leaping out of her chair. "We have no physical proof," Thomas countered sharply. "A ripped-up foreclosure notice and a receipt from the trash won't hold up in arbitration. Corwin will get it thrown out as circumstantial. If we want to win, we need the synthetic stamp, we need a confession, and most importantly, We need to connect William Hastings directly to Gideon Holt on the record. How do we do that? Madeleine asked, her heart racing as she looked at the brilliant legal mind commanding her war room. Thomas pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He didn't dial a lawyer. He dialed the number that had threatened his daughter earlier that day. "What are you doing?" Madeleine hissed, her eyes widening in panic. The line clicked open. "I told you what would happen if you interfered. Janitor." Detective Sullivan's menacing voice growled through the speaker. "Listen to me very carefully. Sullivan," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "You have exactly 2 hours to meet me at the abandoned shipping yards in Red Hook. Bring William Hastings with you. If you don't show up, I am sending the security footage of Preston Corwin accepting Holt's burner phone directly to the FBI, along with Hastings' gambling ledgers. I will burn your boss's empire to the ground by midnight." Thomas hung up the phone, tossing it onto the mahogany table. He looked at Madeleine, his eyes burning with relentless determination. "We are going to walk into their trap, and then we are going to snap it shut on their necks." The fog rolling off the East River was thick and heavy, swallowing the rusted shipping containers at the Red Hook docks in an eerie, oppressive silence. It was 2 a.m. The air smelled of salt and decaying iron. Madeleine Whitmore sat in the passenger seat of her armored SUV, her hands trembling slightly as she watched Thomas Dempsey check the magazine of a sleek black Glock 19. "I don't like this." "Thomas," Madeleine whispered, staring out into the dense fog. "Sullivan is a mercenary. Gideon Holt uses him to make people disappear. We should have brought my security team. If we brought your security team, Sullivan would have spotted them a mile away and aborted the meeting," Thomas replied calmly, sliding the weapon into his shoulder holster and buttoning his suit jacket. "Holt is arrogant, but he isn't stupid. He sent Sullivan here to eliminate a loose end, a floor sweeper who got too lucky. I need them to think they have the upper hand." Thomas turned to her, his gaze intense but reassuring. "Lock the doors. Do not step out of this vehicle under any circumstances. I have the perimeter rigged." Before Madeleine could protest, Thomas opened the door and stepped out into the freezing mist. He walked to the center of the abandoned loading bay, his tailored suit cutting a striking silhouette against the rusted industrial backdrop. He stood perfectly still, waiting. 10 minutes later, the blinding high beams of a black Lincoln Navigator pierced the fog. The massive vehicle crawled into the loading bay, stopping 30 yards from Thomas. The doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. The first 2 were massive, heavily armed thugs. The third man was Detective Sullivan. He was tall and rangy, wearing a dark trench coat, his face scarred and merciless. He held a terrified, shivering William Hastings by the scruff of his neck. The chief financial officer of Aegis Therapeutics looked completely broken, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes darting frantically in the fog. Sullivan let go of Hastings, who stumbled forward onto the wet pavement. Sullivan pulled a suppressed pistol from his coat, keeping it leveled at Thomas's chest. "You've got a lot of nerve, janitor," Sullivan sneered, his gravelly voice echoing off the shipping containers. "I checked the perimeter. No cops, no private security. Just you and the billionaire princess hiding in her armored car. You really thought you could bluff Gideon Holt?" "It wasn't a bluff, Sullivan," Thomas said smoothly, not taking a single step backward. He looked down at the cowering CFO. "Hello, William. You sold out the woman who built your career. You sold out your goddaughter. And for what? So Holt could cover your debts at the Bellagio." William looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I had no choice, Thomas. Holt found out about the money I owed. The people I owed were going to kill me. Holt said, if I forged the signatures and testified against Madeleine, He would wipe the slate clean and give me a seat on the Omnicorp board. I didn't want to hurt her. "Where is the synthetic micro-stamper? William?" Thomas demanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "It's in a safety deposit box at the First Manhattan Depository." William sobbed, clutching his chest. "Box 814. The forged master ledgers are in there too. Holt made me keep them as collateral so I couldn't back out." "Thank you, William," Thomas said coldly. "That was all I needed to hear." Sullivan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He raised his weapon, aiming it directly at Thomas's head. "That's a real touching confession. Too bad neither of you are going to live to tell arbitrator Harrelson about it. Holt wants you dead, Dempsey, and he wants the CFO buried right next to you. It's time to take out the trash." "I completely agree," Thomas smiled. It was a chilling, predatory smile that made Sullivan hesitate for a fraction of a second. "But you misunderstood the bluff. Sullivan, I didn't bring the police." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy remote control. He pressed the single red button in the center. Instantly, the dark loading bay was illuminated by a blinding, daylight-bright explosion of light. High-powered floodlights mounted on top of the shipping containers surrounding the area snapped on, blinding Sullivan and his men. But it wasn't just lights. A booming, amplified voice crackled over a hidden PA system. "This is a live, encrypted broadcast to the personal servers of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Gideon Holt, Detective Sullivan, and William Hastings. You are currently being live-streamed committing armed extortion, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud." Sullivan froze in terror, shielding his eyes from the blinding lights. "You see, Sullivan," Thomas's voice echoed through the speakers, though he stood perfectly still in the center of the yard. "I didn't spend the last 3 years just mopping floors. I spent it studying the electronic security grid of every building in Manhattan. I hijacked the Port Authority's surveillance network 20 minutes before you arrived. Your faces, your weapons, and William's full confession have just been uploaded to the federal cloud. If you pull that trigger, you aren't just committing murder, you are committing a globally broadcasted assassination." The two armed thugs dropped their weapons instantly, backing away with their hands raised. Sullivan lowered his gun, his face contorted in absolute fury and defeat. He knew he was trapped. The footage was already gone. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Madeleine had called the FBI the moment William confessed. Thomas walked slowly toward the defeated fixer, stopping just inches away. He looked Sullivan dead in the eye, the brilliant, ruthless lawyer asserting total dominance over the hired killer. "Tell Gideon Holt," Thomas whispered, his voice laced with venom, "that the janitor is coming for his company next." The 72-hour stay of arbitration expired at exactly 10 a.m. on Monday morning. The atmosphere inside the 52nd floor boardroom of Aegis Therapeutics was electric with anticipation, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and predatory greed. This time, Gideon Holt had not bothered to hide behind the shadows. The CEO of Omnicorp Pharmaceuticals sat proudly at the right hand of Chairman Richard Belmont, wearing a custom navy Brioni suit, casually adjusting the gold Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. Holt was a man who was used to buying whatever he wanted and destroying whoever stood in his way. He had not heard from Detective Sullivan since the night in Red Hook, but in Holt's world, silence usually meant a job successfully executed. He fully expected Madeleine Whitmore to walk through those heavy mahogany doors completely broken, utterly alone, and ready to surrender her empire. Arbitrator Leonard Harrelson sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of judicial stone, organizing his legal pads. The 8 compromised board members whispered among themselves, practically salivating at the thought of the massive Omnicorp payouts that would hit their offshore accounts by noon. At 10:01 a.m., the double doors clicked open. Gideon Holt looked up with a smug, victorious smile, a smile that instantly froze on his face, rapidly turning into an expression of uncomprehending horror. Madeleine Whitmore strode into the boardroom. She was not broken. She was not alone. She radiated the terrifying, unyielding aura of a queen who had just returned from exile to reclaim her throne. But it was the man walking beside her that made Holt's blood run completely cold. Thomas Dempsey walked into the room with the measured, lethal grace of an apex predator. He was no longer the invisible man in the stained blue uniform. He wore a flawless, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His posture was commanding, his jaw set, his eyes locked dead onto Gideon Holt with a terrifying, piercing intensity. Thomas carried a heavy, locked steel briefcase in his right hand. The entire boardroom fell, dead silent. Richard Belmont's jaw went slack. The board members exchanged frantic, terrified glances. "What is the meaning of this?" Holt demanded, his voice suddenly sharp and panicked as he shot out of his chair. He pointed a trembling finger at Thomas. "How are you? Why is he here?" "Arbitrator Harrelson, this man is a janitor. He has no legal standing in this room. I demand he be removed by security immediately." Arbitrator Harrelson banged his gavel, his eyes narrowing at Holt. "Mr. Holt, you are a guest in this arbitration, not a participant. You will sit down and remain silent, or I will have the bailiffs remove you. Ms. Whitmore, who is this man, and in what capacity is he appearing before this tribunal?" Madeleine stood tall, placing her hands on the mahogany table. "Your Honor, I would like to formally introduce my new Chief General Counsel for Aegis Therapeutics, Thomas Dempsey. He is acting as my primary legal representation for all corporate and personal matters." A collective gasp echoed from the board. Holt sank back into his chair, his mind spinning. The floor sweeper was the new general counsel. "Noted," Harrelson said, looking at Thomas with a profound sense of respect. "Mr. Dempsey, you requested a 72-hour stay to gather evidence regarding the alleged embezzlement by Ms. Whitmore. The board is pushing for an immediate vote for her removal. What do you have for me?" "I have the truth, Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice deep, resonant, and echoing with absolute authority. He placed the heavy steel briefcase on the table and snapped the locks open. For the past 3 months, Gideon Holt and this corrupt board of directors have orchestrated a massive, coordinated conspiracy to frame Miss Whitmore for financial crimes she did not commit, in order to facilitate a hostile takeover of Aegis Therapeutics. "Objection! This is slander!" Belmont screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Sit down, Belmont," Thomas snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a small, clear evidence bag containing a metallic, synthetic polymer micro-stamper. He tossed it onto the table in front of Harrelson. "Your Honor, this is a highly sophisticated forgery device manufactured in Geneva. It was recovered yesterday morning from Safety Deposit Box 814 at the First Manhattan Depository. This stamp perfectly replicates the signature of Madeleine Whitmore." Holt's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, pulling out a thick stack of bound ledgers and slamming them down next to the stamp. "These are the original, unaltered financial ledgers of the Aegis R&D Fund. They prove definitively that the $80 million was never embezzled. The money was quietly routed into an offshore shell company owned by Omnicorp, designed to look like Miss Whitmore's personal account." "This proves nothing!" Holt yelled, sweat pouring down his forehead, realizing his entire empire was unraveling in real time. "Anyone could have put that stamp in a deposit box. You have no proof tying me to this." Thomas turned to Holt, a cold, merciless smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man springing a fatal trap. "I don't need to tie you to it, Gideon," Thomas said softly. "Your co-conspirator already did." Thomas turned toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room and gave a single nod. Doors swung open again. 2 armed federal agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division walked into the boardroom, handcuffed between them. Looking utterly destroyed was William Hastings, the chief financial officer of Aegis Therapeutics. The boardroom erupted into total pandemonium. "Order! Order in this room immediately!" Arbitrator Harrelson roared, violently striking his gavel against the sounding block until the frantic shouting of the board members subsided. He pointed his gavel at the handcuffed CFO. "Mr. Dempsey, explain this immediately." Thomas did not flinch amidst the chaos. He buttoned his suit jacket, relishing the absolute terror radiating from Gideon Holt. "Your Honor, William Hastings has already signed a full, sworn confession with the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He confessed to purchasing the micro-stamper, forging Ms. Whitmore's signature, and acting as a paid whistleblower to fabricate the embezzlement charges." Thomas began to slowly pace the length of the boardroom, his voice projecting flawlessly. "In exchange for his perjury, Gideon Holt personally agreed to pay off $12 million of Mr. Hastings' illicit gambling debts. Furthermore, I have submitted to the federal authorities a digitally encrypted audio and video recording of Gideon Holt's private security contractor, Detective Sullivan, attempting to murder both myself and Mr. Hastings at the Red Hook shipping yards to cover up this conspiracy." Holt leaped out of his chair, panic completely overtaking his manufactured composure. "It's a lie. It's an AI deepfake. I am the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. I do not orchestrate hits in shipping yards. I want my lawyers. Your lawyers are currently being raided by the SEC, Mr. Holt," Thomas replied coldly, stopping directly across the table from him. "Along with Preston Corwin, who was arrested at JFK Airport 2 hours ago trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. The conspiracy is over. You lost." Arbitrator Harrelson took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he processed the staggering weight of the evidence. He looked at the trembling board members, then at the defeated CFO, and finally at Madeleine Whitmore, who stood with her head held high. "Given the irrefutable evidence of gross criminal conspiracy, forgery, and extortion," Harrelson announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality, "I am immediately dismissing all allegations of financial misconduct against Madeleine Whitmore. The motion to remove her as CEO is permanently denied." "Thank God," Madeleine breathed, closing her eyes as the crushing weight of the past 3 months evaporated. "Furthermore," Harrelson continued, glaring at Holt, "I am submitting my formal recommendation to the federal authorities that Gideon Holt be indicted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Bailiffs, you may hand Mr. Holt over to the FBI agents." As the federal agents moved toward Holt, Richard Belmont stood up, desperately trying to salvage his own survival. "Ms. Whitmore, Madeleine, you must understand, the board was deceived. We were lied to by Hastings and Holt. We had no idea this was a setup. We fully support your continuation as CEO." Thomas turned his piercing gaze to the chairman of the board. "Under Section 8, Clause 4 of the Aegis Corporate Charter, any board member found to be engaging in undisclosed negotiations with a hostile competitor is guilty of a massive breach of fiduciary duty." Thomas pulled a stack of printed emails from his briefcase and tossed them onto Belmont's lap. These are the encrypted communications between this board and Omnicorp, negotiating your multi-million-dollar exit packages upon Ms. Whitmore's removal. You weren't deceived, Belmont. You were bought. Belmont stared at the emails, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. "I, as Chief General Counsel," Thomas declared, his voice ringing like a death knell for the corrupt executives. "I am executing a for-cause termination for all 8 members of this board, effective immediately. Your stock options are frozen, your severance packages are voided, and you have exactly 5 minutes to vacate this building before I have you arrested for corporate espionage." The board members scrambled, grabbing their briefcases and rushing out of the boardroom like rats fleeing a sinking ship, leaving only Gideon Holt in the custody of the FBI. As the agent slapped the steel handcuffs onto Holt's wrists, Holt glared at Thomas, his eyes filled with venomous hatred. "You think you've won, janitor. My company is still 3 times the size of Aegis. My board will post my bail, and Omnicorp will bury you in litigation for the next 10 years. Thomas smiled. It was the same chilling, predatory smile he had shown in the Red Hook shipping yards. "Actually, Gideon, Omnicorp isn't going to do anything, because you don't own it anymore." Holt froze. "What are you talking about?" When William Hastings confessed to the FBI last night, Thomas explained smoothly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "He also surrendered the routing numbers for the offshore accounts you used to pay him and Preston Corwin. Those accounts contained corporate funds from Omnicorp. You used shareholder money to fund a criminal enterprise." Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a devastating whisper. "At 8:10 a.m. this morning, I filed an emergency proxy injunction with the Delaware Court of Chancery, because Omnicorp's funds were used in a federal RICO conspiracy. The SEC has frozen Omnicorp's trading. Your stock has plummeted 70% in the last hour. Your shareholders are in absolute panic. And 15 minutes ago, Aegis Therapeutics launched a hostile, all-cash counter-takeover of Omnicorp Pharmaceuticals for pennies on the dollar." Holt's knees buckled. The federal agents had to hold him up by his armpits. "You tried to steal her company," Thomas said, his voice cold as ice. "So she just bought yours. Get him out of my boardroom." The agents dragged a hyperventilating, ruined Gideon Holt out of the room, the heavy mahogany doors slamming shut behind him. The boardroom was finally empty, save for Thomas Dempsey, Madeleine Whitmore, and arbitrator Harrelson. Harrelson quietly packed his briefcase, gave Thomas a deeply respectful nod, and exited the room. Madeleine turned to Thomas. The silence in the room was deafening. The war was over. She walked slowly toward him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and did something the ruthless billionaire CEO had never done in her entire professional life. She wrapped her arms around the former janitor and hugged him tightly. The embrace in the silent, glass-walled boardroom was the collision of 2 worlds that had inexplicably saved each other. Thomas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hands hovering, before he gently returned the embrace, wrapping his arms around the woman whose empire he had just secured. For the first time in 5 agonizing years, the crushing, suffocating weight of sheer survival was gone. He didn't have to fight the shadows anymore. He didn't have to be invisible. Madeleine stepped back, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, though her eyes blazed with a triumphant, unstoppable fire. "You are quite literally the most terrifying lawyer I have ever seen in my life. Thomas Dempsey, Columbia Law School should build a bronze statue of you." Thomas offered a rare, genuine smile, adjusting his tailored cuffs. "I prefer the corner office you promised me." Ms. Whitmore. "It's yours," she laughed, the sound bright and ringing with immense relief. "Along with whatever else you want. You didn't just save my company today. You saved my legacy, and we have a lot of work to do." 6 months later, the corporate landscape of Manhattan was completely unrecognizable. The hostile counter-takeover of Omnicorp had been a bloodbath of financial precision under Thomas's ruthless legal direction. Aegis Therapeutics absorbed Omnicorp's assets, liquidated its corrupt subsidiaries, and cemented its place as the undisputed titan of the global pharmaceutical industry. Gideon Holt was currently residing in a federal penitentiary without bail, awaiting trial on 74 counts of racketeering, extortion, and corporate fraud. Alongside his former fixer, Detective Sullivan, Preston Corwin had been permanently disbarred and was facing a decade behind bars for bribery and witness tampering. The corrupt board of directors at Aegis had been entirely replaced. Thomas had meticulously vetted every new appointee, ensuring that the company was guided by ethics and science, rather than unchecked greed. He didn't just fire the corrupt executives, he pursued them with relentless civil litigation, clawing back every cent they had tried to steal. The financial press dubbed him the Janitor General, a moniker he wore with ironclad pride. He traded his yellow mop bucket for a sprawling corner office on the 52nd floor, right next to Madeleine's. He commanded a legal department of 200 high-powered attorneys, and under his protection, Aegis stock had tripled in value. Yet, despite his terrifying reputation in the courtroom, he always left the office precisely at 5 o'clock. He never missed his daughter's dinner, but none of the wealth, the power, or the corporate victories mattered to Thomas as much as the scene unfolding before him on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in Central Park. Thomas stood on the edge of the great lawn, the autumn breeze rustling his cashmere overcoat. A few yards away, a little girl with a tangle of dark curls was running across the grass, chasing a bright red frisbee. She was laughing, a clear, beautiful, unbroken sound that carried through the cool air. There was no wheezing, there was no desperate gasping for breath. There were no oxygen tanks, no inhalers, and no midnight emergency room visits. Lily Dempsey was perfectly healthy. The full course of Respirex, the experimental biologic therapy developed by Aegis Therapeutics, had performed a medical miracle. Her lungs had completely healed. The dark shadows under her eyes were gone, replaced by the vibrant, rosy glow of a normal, happy 7-year-old child. "She's getting faster," a soft voice said from beside him. Thomas turned. Madeleine Whitmore was walking across the grass, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She wore a chic trench coat and a warm, radiant smile. She handed one of the cups to Thomas and stood beside him, watching Lily sprint after a golden retriever that had stolen her frisbee. "Dr. Reynolds said her latest scans were flawless," Thomas murmured, taking a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving his daughter. He officially classified her asthma as being in total remission. "She asked me this morning if she could join a competitive soccer league next spring." Madeleine's eyes softened with profound emotion. "And what did you say to her?" "I told her I would just buy the team." Thomas smirked, earning a bright laugh from the billionaire CEO. Madeleine stepped a little closer, their shoulders brushing. The dynamic between them had shifted dramatically over the past 6 months. They were no longer just a boss and an employee. They were equals. They were partners who had forged an unbreakable bond in the fires of a vicious corporate war. "The board approved the new endowment this morning," Madeleine said quietly, turning to look up at him. "The new pediatric respiratory wing at Mount Sinai is officially fully funded. We break ground next month." Thomas looked down at her, his throat tightening. "Madeleine, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she insisted, her gaze locking onto his. It's going to be called the Sarah Dempsey Memorial Wing. No family should ever have to lose everything just to keep the people they love alive. Not when we have the power and the resources to change it. Thomas felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. For years, the memory of his late wife had been tied to crushing debt, despair, and failure. Now, her name would be etched in stone above a hospital wing that would save thousands of children. Madeleine hadn't just given him his career back. She had restored his dignity and healed his family's deepest wound. "Thank you," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "Daddy! Madeleine! Look!" Lily shouted, running back toward them, her face flushed with excitement. She practically launched herself into Madeleine's arms. The billionaire CEO, who used to strike terror into the hearts of Wall Street executives, caught the little girl easily, spinning her around while Lily giggled uncontrollably. Thomas watched the two most important people in his life laughing together under the autumn sun. He thought about the cold, lonely nights pushing a mop across empty marble floors. He thought about the despair that used to choke him, and the burner phone in a trash can that had changed the trajectory of the world. He was no longer the invisible man. He was a father, a protector, and a kingmaker. The man who swept the floors had cleaned out the corruption of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and in the process, he had finally found his way home. Madeleine set Lily down and looked over at Thomas, extending her hand. "Ready to head back to the office, counselor? We have an empire to run." Thomas smiled, taking her hand firmly in his. "Lead the way, Miss Whitmore." What an absolutely incredible journey. From scrubbing floors in the dead of night to sitting in the ultimate seat of power. Thomas Dempsey proved that a father's relentless love and a brilliant mind can tear down even the most corrupt billionaire empires. He didn't just save Madeleine Whitmore, he shattered her enemies, secured a beautiful legacy for his late wife, and gave his daughter the healthy, happy life she deserved. If this epic tale of redemption, corporate warfare, and an underdog claiming his rightful throne left you breathless, smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable dramatic stories.